Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am happy to be here with you. Question for you. Do you remember a million years ago, if you happen to listen to that episode? I know, a million years, that's hyperbole, but you know I love hyperbole. So do you remember a million years ago when I said that I was going to do my next episode on gardens and plants, and that it was kind of a weird story? Well, then life happened, as life often does, and I am just now getting around to doing that. So it was the longest teaser ever. Not ever, okay, that's again hyperbole. Gosh, just leave me alone, okay? At any rate, so this all came about because my coworker at one of my jobs has a plant, and I am in the office every day in the mornings, and she is often not in the office every day, so she asks me often to water her plant while she's gone. Not a problem. Its name is Planty. I did not name it, although I probably would have named it, I don't know, I name everything Norman, or some other old man name. So Planty, it needs to be watered, and my coworker was saying one day that she worries that it's not getting enough TLC, you know, it doesn't get direct sunlight, or maybe it would do better if it were in some fresh air every once in a while. And so I jokingly said, well, do you want me to start taking it outside and giving it spa days? And I actually did that one day. I took it outside and let it soak up some sunshine, and Planty is looking quite lovely. And then I started joking that I could take it outside, give it its spa day, and read to it, because, you know, you're supposed to talk to plants. It's supposed to help them, which got me thinking, okay, what would I read to the plant? Well, probably you could read anything to a plant because, you know, they're just soaking up the attention along with the sunshine, right? But no, I need a theme. I always have to have a theme for everything. So what would I read to a plant besides books that are set in a garden or books about plants? I wouldn't necessarily read nonfiction books about plants. I might. It depends on if I was in the mood for a nonfiction book about plants. I'm not saying I have anything against nonfiction books about plants. I'm sure they're very interesting and that I would learn a lot. But I would read stories that are set in a garden, which then led me down the garden path of finding out some of those books. Now, the first one that popped into mind, of course, is The Secret Garden. And if you don't know The Secret Garden, if you've never read it or haven't seen a movie or even heard of it, I don't even know. But it is by Frances Hodgson Burnett, and it has had numerous adaptations made of it as a movie. But the book itself was first published in book form in 1911 after it had been published as a serial in 1910, a serial version in a U.S. magazine. The book is set in England, and it was originally published by Stokes with illustrations by Maria Louise Kirk, signed as M.L. Kirk. And the British edition it was published by Heinemann with illustrations by Charles Keith Robinson. And then, of course, as I've said, it's been many versions of movies. So what is The Secret Garden about? Well, it is It's considered a classic of English children's literature. Mary Lennox, a sickly and unloved 10-year-old girl, is ignored by her wealthy parents who never wanted her. She is cared for by servants who allow her to become spoiled and self-centered, but after she is sent to live on her uncle's isolated manor, everything changes when she discovers a secret garden. That sort of tells you something, but not a lot. Yes, Mary Lennox she's understandably kind of she's been spoiled, she's been ignored, all those things that make for maybe a not so nice child. She's eventually sent to live with her uncle, and she's rude like always. She, of course, doesn't like her new home. She doesn't like the people that are there. She's just grumpy about everything. And she doesn't like where she lives. It's on a moor. Of course, it's on a moor. What dreary book isn't set on a moor? But there is a good-natured maid named Martha Sowerby who tells Mary about the late Mrs. Craven, who would spend hours in a private walled garden growing roses. Mrs. Craven died after an accident in the garden, and the devastated Mr. Craven locked the garden and buried the key. Mary becomes interested in finding the secret garden herself, and her ill manners begin to soften as a result. Soon she comes to enjoy the company of Martha, the gardener Ben Weatherstaff, and a friendly Robin Redbreast. Her health and attitude improve, and she grows stronger as she explores the moor and plays with a skipping rope that Mrs. Sowerby buys for her. Mary wonders about both the secret garden and the mysterious cries that echo through the house at night. So she explores, so she discovers this garden, and then she discovers the source of the mysterious cries. And basically, it's just, a story of a young girl who's been neglected, who finds healing in nature, as often happens. She finds this secret garden and begins to enjoy spending time in it, begins actually making some friends and not being so rude and grumpy about everything. And then she discovers a boy who is the source of the mysterious cries, and he is sick and bedridden, but Mary is nothing if not stubborn, and she determines that he's not really sick, and she takes it upon herself to start getting him up and making him do stuff, and it's amazing. It's an unspecified problem, but he is again spending most of his time in bed. He is the son of Mr. and Mrs. Craven, and so his name is Colin, and Mary just takes it upon herself to ignore everything the doctors and the servants have said about his condition. And I don't know how she decides that she has the medical knowledge to do this, but she gets him up and moving. And eventually, of course, his father, who's often traveling abroad, as so often happens in these books, comes home. He sees the improved health and the improved spirits, and he finally comes home when he receives a letter from Mrs. Sowerby, and things turn out very well, all because Mary was stubborn and persistent, and she found the secret garden, and it healed her, and she was then able to heal Colin through a series of just being really stubborn and not listening to anyone. So it is it's a lovely story if you can get through the first part where everybody's annoying and everybody Mary is not exactly the most lovable character at first, and of course you understand part of that because she is a product of her environment, of the way she was raised, being both, as I said, incredibly spoiled and incredibly neglected and unwanted by her parents. That's going to shape a young mind. But she does find healing in nature, and that's why I think it would be a lovely book to read to a plant. The plant, of course, could feel good about being a healing source for a young girl in this story. And yes, I did just anthropomorphize, and yeah, you know what I mean, the plant. But Planty, I think would feel good about hearing a story wherein the child is healed by nature and another child is also healed as well. And, of course, it's more than just their physical ailments that are healed. They're healed mentally and spiritually, and their relationships become better. Even the father eventually is healed spiritually, mentally, emotionally, all of those good things because of one little girl's obsession with finding a secret garden. So we are going to take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be moving on to some other books that you might want to read to your plants. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. Keith keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. We are talking in today's episode about books that you might want to read to your plants, or, just read if you like gardens or whatever. And the first one we talked about, of course, was The Secret Garden. And then, as I am wont to do, I went and did an internet search to find lists of books about gardens. And there are so many books with garden in the name, of course. The first one on the Goodreads list that I pulled up first was The Secret Garden, not shocking. The Forgotten Garden, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, Tom's Midnight Garden, Garden Spells, Elizabeth and Her German Garden, The Samurai's Garden, The Garden Party and Other Stories. Garden, The Constant Gardener, The Virgin in the Garden. So you get the point. There are lots and lots of books about gardens. We are going to move on to another children's book. The Secret Garden is, of course, a children's book. I don't know if I mentioned that, but you probably already knew that, being the brilliant listeners that you are. The next one is A Child's Garden of Verses. This one is by Robert Louis Stevenson, and it is it's a book of poetry, of course. It's one of the most famous children's collections of poetry ever published. It was written by Robert Louis Stevenson for children about the joys and sorrows of childhood, touching on themes like illness and solitude, as well as make-believe games and plays. The collection includes stories like Foreign Children, The Lamplighter, The Land of Counterpane, Bed in Summer, My Shadow, The Swing. And so, this is not exactly set in a garden. It's a garden of verses. So it's a little more, a little less tangible maybe, but if you want to read your plant poetry, then you might want to turn to this. The description says, whether you're a collector or just want to share these incredible tales with the young readers in your life, this book will provide readers with countless hours of unforgettable stories and artwork. It is recommended for ages 4 through 8, grade level, preschool through 3rd grade. And there's, again, a lot of different versions of this. It's been out for a while. A while being well over 100 years. This one came out in 1885. So what is that? 25 years before The Secret Garden was published as a serial. And of course it has, as I said, many, many different versions and editions have been out, many different illustrated versions with different illustrators. So depending on the version that you find, for reading to your plant may not care about the illustrations, but your child might. And so you want to find one with illustrations that speak to you, and then you can introduce your child to poetry. Robert Louis Stevenson was, if you are unfamiliar, a Scottish author. And this is an interesting fact. In 1922, the classical scholar Reveille Glover published a translation of the poems into Latin, which is interesting. I mean, I suppose Latin was still being taught, and it's not taught as much anymore, but So if you are interested in Latin and you want to read to your plant in Latin, there is somewhere out there a Latin version of A Child's Garden of Verses. I know you want that. Some of you might, and hey, more power to you. If you can read Latin and if you collect books in Latin, you are awesome. And I don't know if I'm envious, but I'm impressed. I am envious of people who can read in other languages comfortably or are learning other languages. I am not great with languages, but I know a little bit of some, just enough to probably get me in trouble. I don't know. Let's go ahead and move on to our next book. So this one actually is nonfiction. I know I said that I wasn't going to talk about nonfiction, but I meant nonfiction in the sense of books that are, specifically about plants themselves. Again, nothing wrong with that. I should probably learn more about gardening, etc. But this one is a biography. It's called The Paper Garden. An artist begins her life's work at 72. The title jumped out and grabbed me. This was from one of the lists that I was looking at. It is by an author named Molly Peacock. It is about a woman named Mary Delaney who was 72 years old when she noticed a petal drop from a geranium. In a flash of inspiration, she picked up her scissors and cut out a paper replica of the petal, inventing the art of collage. It was the summer of 1772 in England. Are you noticing a theme? We're much older than 100 years in terms of these stories. Not this book, of course, but the setting for this biography. During the next 10 years, she completed nearly 1,000 cut paper botanicals, which she called mosaics, so accurate that botanists still refer to them. Poet-biographer Molly Peacock uses close-ups of these brilliant collages in The Paper Garden to track the extraordinary life of Delaney, friend of Swift, Handel, Hogarth, and even Queen Charlotte and King George III. She sounds like a fascinating woman just from that first paragraph, but now listen to this second paragraph. How did this remarkable role model for late blooming manage it? After a disastrous teenage marriage to a drunken 61-year-old squire, she took control of her own life, pursuing creative projects, spurning suitors, and gaining friends. At 43, she married Jonathan Swift's friend, Dr. Patrick Delaney, and lived in Ireland in a true expression of midlife love. But after 25 years in a terrible lawsuit, her husband died. Sent into a netherland of mourning, Mrs. Delaney was rescued by her friend, the fabulously wealthy Duchess of Portland. The Duchess introduced Delaney to the botanical adventures of the day and a bonanza of exotic plants from Captain Cook's voyage, which became the inspiration for her art. Peacock herself first saw Mrs. Delaney's work more than 20 years before she wrote The Paper Garden, but like a book you know is too old for you, she put the thought of the old woman away. She went on to marry and cherish the happiness of her own midlife in a parallel to Mrs. Delaney, and by chance rediscovered the mosaics decades later. This encounter confronted the poet with her own aging and gave her and her readers a blueprint for late life flexibility, creativity, and change. That is one of the most thorough descriptions of a book on Amazon that I have ever seen, and I am fascinated. This is going on my list someday. It's going on my list of books that I want to read. This woman sounds fascinating. And even without the collages and the mosaics, she had a pretty crazy life. And she sounds like a really interesting person, an interesting role model, a role model for really changing the course of your life any number of times, kind of just going with what happens and making the best of it. So, will your plant enjoy this book? Hey, maybe, but it sounds great to me. And again, I know I'm asking if your plant will enjoy the book. You know your plants better than I do. You know what maybe they want to read in life. I don't know these things. I don't know your life. I don't know your plants' lives. I don't have plants. I used to have plants. I used to have a ton of plants. And then I moved so many times after college. And I just I stopped collecting them. Like I moved all of my plants from college, got left behind in Montana when I moved to Texas because I moved in January and I didn't want to try to transport house plants. And then all of my Texas plants got left behind when I moved to Berkeley for grad school because I moved in January and I didn't want to transport house plants in the winter. And I have had a few since then. I got several for my 40th birthday several years ago, and they all died. One of them didn't die. No, it eventually died. So poof. I don't know if I don't have a green thumb. I don't know if I just don't pay enough attention, or if I'm not reading to my plants. Probably that's it. I should get a plant, and I should read to it, and I should report back to you as to whether it dies, or I forget to water it. Yeah, we're going to take our second break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be finishing up this episode of What to Read to Your Plants. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Today's episode is What to Read to Your Plants, which maybe is kind of ridiculous, but it's okay. Sometimes I need a little ridiculous in my life, and maybe you do too. My husband has been gone this week. He is at his class reunion, and so I have been talking to my dogs a lot. I talk to my dogs all the time anyway. I shouldn't use that as an excuse, but maybe I will say I've been talking to my dogs and it leads to various levels of ridiculousness. I don't know. I'm just making up excuses now. Let's just wrap this episode up, shall we? Okay, our next book is one that I have not read, but is by an author that I have featured on the podcast before. That is Catherine M. Valenti. She is the author of, the books all have the really long names. Give me just a second. Well, the girl who circumnavigated fairyland in a ship of her own making. And I have talked about that series before. She has such an interesting way with words. And so I am definitely intrigued by this one. It's called, it's a series called The Orphan's Tales, and the book is In the Night Garden. Let's see. So it is, it's billed as Arabian Nights for Our Time, a lush and fantastical epic guaranteed to spirit you away from the very first page. So, secreted away in a garden, a lonely girl spins stories to warm a curious prince. Peculiar feats and unspeakable fates that loop through each other and back again to meet in the tapestry of her voice. Inked on her eyelids, each twisting, tattooed tale is a piece in the puzzle of the girl's own hidden history. And what tales she tells. Tales of shape-shifting witches and wild horsewomen, heron kings and the beast princesses, snake gods, dog monks, and living stars. Each story more strange and fantastic than the ones that came before. From ill-tempered mermaid to fastidious beast, nothing is ever quite what it seems in these ever-shifting tales, even and especially their teller. This is adorned with illustrations by the legendary Michael Kaluta. Valenti's enchanting lyrical fantasy offers a breathtaking reinvention of the untold myths and dark fairy tales that shape our dreams. And just when you think you've come to the end, you realize the adventure has only begun. So, as I said, I have not read this one, but I have read her other series, the first of which is The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making. She has such an interesting way with just fantastic stories and the way she writes about them. I'm trying to see now how many books might be. Oh, it's just 2. So 2 of 2 in the Orphans series. And the second one is called In the Cities of Coin and Spice. So first one, garden, second one, city. And it's going to go on my list as well. Add it to that list of things that I'll hopefully someday maybe get to. Who knows? Maybe you can read it and let me know how it is, please. So a few other books as we are wrapping up this episode. I've talked about some children's books, but I also wanted to maybe look for some like picture books, and all of the books except all of the books are illustrated in some way, but I wanted to look specifically at picture books. And the first one that popped up that made me smile was The Carrot Seed, which is by Ruth Krauss, and Crockett Johnson is the illustrator. It is a classic story, kind of right in there with Harold and the Purple Crayon. But this one is when a little boy plants a carrot seed, everyone tells him it won't grow. But when you are very young, there are some things that you just know. And the little boy knows that one day a carrot will come up. So he waters his seed and he pulls the weeds and he waits. This beautifully simple classic teaches the patience and technique of planting a seed and helping it grow. It was first published in 1945 and has never been out of print. It is the timeless combination of Ruth Krauss's simple text and Crockett Johnson's eloquent illustration, and it creates a triumphant and deeply satisfying story for readers of all ages. This was a story that I read as a child and has a special place in my heart. That little boy was convinced that his carrot was going to grow. Thank you very much. Do not tell him different. So that is a very encouraging story to read to your plants. You know, there are humans that are going to care for you no matter what people say. Again, do I need therapy? Probably. It's okay though. And then just a few more books to mention in terms of children's picture books that you could read with your children or your plants or your animals or just to yourself. It doesn't matter. And one is called Flower Garden, and it is about a family who's living in a city apartment who creates their own garden. A little girl and her father go to the grocery store and buy flowering plants. Then they take the bus back to their city apartment. There they plant a window box as a birthday present for the little girl's mother. It is written by Eve Bunting, and it is told in rhyme and illustrated with lovely realistic paintings by Catherine Hewitt. It has been apparently a hit with 3 to 6-year-olds. The cover looks beautiful, and I love that they are creating a garden in the city. There's a book called Planting the Rainbow. You know, we're encouraged to eat the rainbow. This one is Planting the Rainbow, and you can, it's about planting a rainbow of flowers. It is by Lois Elhert, and it is about a mother and a child who do plant a rainbow, beginning with bulbs in the fall and seeds and seedlings in the spring, and ending with a beautiful garden of flowers in a veritable rainbow of colors. So that is always fun. There's just a lot of book. Oh, there's one called Growing Vegetable Soup. Maybe you don't want to read that one to your plants because they might get nervous. You don't want nervous plants. They won't grow appropriately. So don't read about making vegetable soup. But if you want to talk about growing your own vegetables and where our food comes from, that might be good to read with your kids. But don't read it to your plants. No, don't freak out your plants. There's a ton of books out there that are set in gardens, that have something to do with gardens, that people are wandering around in gardens, etc., etc. And if it's summer and maybe you have planted your own garden, maybe you want to read books about gardening, books about books set in gardens, read with your children, read to your plants, whatever you might be interested in. There are a million, trillion, gazillion books out there that could go on this list, but that would make for an incredibly long podcast. So we are just going to wrap this up. Thank you so much for joining me. Please join me again on Tuesday when we'll be back to our Tuesday interview. This week I am speaking with author Joseph Reed about his Seth Walker novels. This is a series featuring a former air marshal whose name is Seth Walker. They are thrillers, and we'll be talking about the first two books in that series. They are called Takeoff and False Horizons. So join me for that conversation on Tuesday. In the meantime, have a wonderful weekend, and whether or not you're reading to your plants or yourself or your children or your dogs, make sure you take some time to get lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.